This is the Jackson Neill Sports Podcast. Welcome back to the podcast here on Monday, October 28th, 2019. The day after the sports equinox, the day where all four major pro sports were in action yesterday, was a really, really fun sports weekend. But it's not pro sports I want to talk about today. It's college football. Because after another weekend of results, some surprising, some not so, there's a big storyline that's developing after the biggest upset of the weekend. And it involves Oklahoma. I want to touch on that in just a second. But before I jump into that, I want to remind everyone that this podcast is available on all of your favorite streaming platforms. That includes Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, basically wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find this one. So make sure to rate and subscribe so you can get new episodes every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And I'm starting to bring guests back on the podcast. Had a great week last week. Had Brian Mears of the Action Network, Chuck Freeman of 105.7 FM The Fan out in Milwaukee, Josh Brogerdy of 5ABC up in Boston. So guests are coming back on the podcast, so you don't want to miss any upcoming episodes. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there was a big upset this weekend in college football, and that, of course, came by way of Kansas State's 48-41 win over Oklahoma. The 5-2 Wildcats, as they now are, were able to bring the Sooners into the Little Apple, Manhattan, Kansas, and pull off the upset. For a second there, it looked like Oklahoma recovered an onside kick with about a little over a minute or so remaining, and that they might have a chance to march down the field and tie the game up. But it appeared that it touched an Oklahoma player before it reached the required 10 yards down the field. So Kansas State was able to hold on. So with that win, it, of course, dropped Oklahoma down the rankings. They were previously number 5 in the AP poll, now all the way down to number 10, so still in the top 10, but not by very much, getting that last spot right there. And with that, they are still the highest ranking team in the Big 12 in the AP top 25. They're coming in 2 spots higher than Baylor. Undefeated Bears are currently 12 as they're 7-0. As opposed to Oklahoma's 7-1. I'm not sure if I agree with that ranking, but basically the point remains that the Big 12 has one top 10 team with another team right there knocking on the door after this Oklahoma loss. However, when I look at this Oklahoma loss and when I look at the ramifications that this possibly has, you realize that it's starting to shake. It was really one of the first big dominoes to fall in this season that has been marked as just one of the most consistent ever. I mean, yes, we did have the Georgia loss, and yes, we did have the Wisconsin loss, 2 teams that we thought were really towards the top, but not really the top 4. We kind of had this top 4 mindset, or maybe top 5 mindset of, looked like Clemson and Oklahoma were each going to go through their conferences, go undefeated, win either the ACC for Clemson, win the Big 12 for Oklahoma, and basically with not very much struggle. I mean, Clemson had a couple tough games in the schedule, if you could say that. I mean, that game against at Syracuse looked like it was going to be tough, but we saw the Orange weren't really legit. They had that game where they hosted Texas A&M. Even though A&M's good, they're not even a top 25 team anymore. They still have Wake Forest on the schedule, but the point remains that Clemson really does not have that tough of a road to go undefeated and win their conference. Now, for Oklahoma, it was a little bit tougher. I think the Big 12 is a lot better, top to bottom, than the ACC. I mean, teams like Kansas State, Baylor is really having a great year. Even Texas, even though they've fallen down the rankings after a couple losses, they're still a good football team. So Oklahoma had a little bit tougher of a schedule, but still the point remains that it looked like them and Clemson were each going to go undefeated and win out their conferences. That would give the 2 of the college football playoff teams, 2 teams who have really made a staple in the past several years of getting there each and every season. Then it looked like there was going to be a 1-loss or undefeated champion of the Big 10. At first it looked like it was going to be either Ohio State and Wisconsin. Obviously, Wisconsin has dropped out of that now, losing 2 straight, once to Illinois, and this past weekend getting absolutely blown out by Ohio State. Wisconsin did not look like they belonged on that field. They're down all the way to 18th in the rankings at 6-2, and their national championship hopes all but gone. And even though Penn State's still sticking around there, Ohio State still looks like the clear favorite in the Big Ten. I mean, they look like possibly the best team in the country, depending on who you ask, with the way that they've been playing and the results they have on the field. I mean, they're third right now, but personally, I would have them as number 2. And then it looked like the SEC was going to get one team in. I mean, as it always does. I mean, the winner of the SEC is basically a lock to get into the college football playoff, unless some crazy thing where a 2-loss SEC team were to make it in, were to win the conference. I mean, I don't see a scenario where the SEC would not get a team. And even in that, I mean, come on, the SEC is just head and shoulders above everyone else. So as I look around and I see, okay, now that first domino really started to fall. That first top 4 team we really claimed to have among the top 4 we thought of going into the season of Clemson, Oklahoma, Alabama, Ohio State, one of them fell. And now Oklahoma still is on pace and looks like they're probably the presumable favorite to win the Big 12. I mean, by getting ranked higher than Baylor, I'm guessing people are going to favor them over the Bears or think that they're a better football team. But since it's at Baylor, possibly Baylor might be the favorite team, but it's going to be a close game no matter what. But it still looks like there's a very very realistic shot that Oklahoma goes and wins out the Big 12. And in my eyes, they're still the best team. Yes, Baylor has looked great. Yes, they are undefeated, but I just don't see them being able to beat an Oklahoma team. I think Oklahoma just has so much firepower. They have more talent. I don't know about on the defensive side of the ball, but certainly on the offensive side of the ball. They're still my favorite in the Big 12. But the point remains is that with this loss, who benefits the most? For a second, it looked like possibly Notre Dame. I mean, Notre Dame was a team with one loss and, made a schedule that's really just a big question mark. Would they possibly get? I mean, that loss to Georgia is looking worse and worse, especially after that loss to South Carolina. Would Notre Dame possibly get another shot? Losing to Michigan, that dashes all their hopes. But as I look around the college football landscape, there's one conference that really seems to be benefiting from this Oklahoma loss, and that has to be the SEC. So right now with the SEC, you have 5 teams in the top 25. But it's a top-heavy top 25 with the SEC. All 5 of those teams are in the top 11, 4 in the top 10, Auburn being the lowest ranked at number 11. I even disagree with that one a little bit. But if you look at all of those teams, how top-heavy this conference is, compare that to even the bottom dwellers of the conference. I'm looking at someone like South Carolina, a team that did not look that great this past week, but still has an upset over a top 10 team. Texas A&M, they've gone through their struggles. They're not ranked anymore. But, 2 of their losses have come against Alabama and Clemson, including that Clemson game on the road. How bad of a loss really is that? I know Clemson pretty much dominated, but Texas A&M still put up somewhat of a fight. So, top to down, I've been making this argument all season long, and I don't think I'm alone in this, that the SEC is clearly the best conference. But the hardest part with this one is just the tendency that the SEC seems to be the conference where everyone beats up on each other, where everyone gives each other a couple losses. I think the biggest team you could look at for this season is Auburn. Auburn has a win over a top 10 team, Oregon, but they've also lost to 2 teams. Both those losses, LSU and Florida, teams that are right now in the top 10. So you look at, and they still have a game against Alabama coming up. Just a murderer's row of a schedule. It was at LSU, at Florida, and they get to host Alabama, I guess that's a plus, but they also still have Georgia on the schedule. So a team like Auburn, who I think you put them in the ACC, and they're competing with Clemson, I think they're the favorite in that conference. They're probably going to end the season with 3 or 4 losses simply because they have to play such a tough schedule. So now as I look at this Oklahoma loss, now as I look at this different college football landscape, there's going to be a difficult decision that has to be made, and I think it's going to come down. I've been talking about this all season long, and it's the argument I've been making all season long as you go back and look at the results of the recent college football playoff, where it seems like the committee has started to weigh conference championships more than strength of schedule, or more than just how a team looks on the field. And go back and look at the numbers. Whether it's Michigan State getting blown out, Oregon getting blown out, all these different teams throughout these years of the college football playoff, just in the semifinal round, games not even being close, simply because teams were able to win their conference championship, and they got in over teams who maybe looked better, but didn't get that conference championship win. And what I mean by that is, right now with Alabama and LSU set up to face off in just 2 weeks, is that's going to be the presumable number 1 versus number 2 matchup in college football. The first time I think that's happened since 2011 when LSU and Alabama did so, and Alabama came out 9-6. Is that if LSU goes in there and they lose that game, if LSU ends up losing that game, they're going to lose the SEC West. That they're going to be be a game behind Alabama at that point. And even though if Alabama loses to Auburn, Alabama will still have the head-to-head versus LSU. So basically, LSU would miss out on playing for the conference championship. But you're here to tell me that the LSU team that has beaten at the time a top 10 Texas team on the road, then beat a top 10 Auburn team at the time, as well as getting another top 10 win earlier in the season against Florida, that they don't deserve to get into the college football playoff compared with a team like Oklahoma, a team that really, besides that Texas win and possibly a Baylor win, would not have really proved all that much. Certainly not to the level that LSU has. And I think that's what the conversation is going to start to center around, is where does conference championships, strength of schedule, and how teams look on the field compare to one another? Because at this point, I look at the past results of the college football playoff. I look at these blowouts that we get each and every single season in the semifinal, and I say that the college football playoff committee is not doing a good job. They are picking the wrong teams to compete for the national championship. And the biggest reason they're doing that is because they're weighing conference championships more than strength of schedule. Is that Oklahoma, watch them play. That you're telling me if LSU goes out there and loses by 1 score at Alabama, the number 2 team in the nation, but wins out the rest of their games, which they most certainly could, only facing Ole Miss, Arkansas, and Texas A&M, and they end the season with 1 loss, 11-1, and that 1 loss is at arguably the toughest place to play in college football by 1 score, that they don't deserve to get in over Oklahoma. I think this is where the committee starts to make these mistakes. I think this is where the college football playoff starts to go off the rails, is that the mission of this is to not put conference champions together to play for a national title. The mission of this is to put the best teams on the field against each other. Is that I'm almost ready to say at this point that regardless of the finish of this regardless if they win or lose against Alabama, that LSU deserves to be in the college football playoff as of right now, that they have a strong enough resume. Now, granted, if they get upset by Ole Miss or Arkansas or Texas A&M, this point's kind of void, and that's why they played these games. But as of right now, if these games just kind of go exactly how we expect them, that if LSU, let's say they lose by 3 points to Alabama, at Alabama, and then they blow out the remaining 3 opponents, that I think that team is a college football playoff team, and that I necessarily don't really care who wins the SEC at that point. That I think the winner of the SEC, if it's Alabama undefeated, they should definitely get in, but that 1-loss LSU team should get in over a 1-loss Big 12 champion, or even a 1-loss Big 10 champion, because the level that they have had to play at, against the strength of schedule they have had to play at, proves to me they're national championship worthy, that they are able to play for national championship and it won't be a blowout. And that's something the committee has screwed up in a lot of years recently. I mean, look at some of these scores that you get in the past couple of years in the semifinals. I mean, I've covered this in multiple podcasts, just how many blowouts you're basically due for a multi-touchdown game every single year. Last year was Notre Dame. A couple of years before was Michigan State. I think Oregon was in there 1 year getting destroyed. Florida State has. These teams where they just were able to, Notre Dame's case, they went undefeated, but they didn't really look that great, and yet we still gave them the college football playoff berth just for them to lose 30-3. Michigan State wins their conference just for them to not even be able to compete on the level of teams like Clemson or Alabama. So I'm thinking that for the college football playoff committee, for college football in general, this is going to be a perfect season for them to kind of say, okay, we're switching. We're switching our mindset. We're saying that strength of schedule, that how teams look on the field is more important than a conference championship. And the perfect way to do that is put a team like LSU in, a 1-loss LSU team possibly, in over a conference champion 1-loss Oklahoma team. Because as of right now, and I'm going to go out and say and predict the rest of the season, it looks like LSU is a lot better of a team, and they're a lot more worthy to be playing for a national title. That's going to wrap it up for this episode of the Jackson Neill Sports Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, make sure to subscribe and rate this podcast on your favorite platforms. New episode every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, coming at you 3 times a week. Had some great guests last week. Have some more coming for you guys, so stay tuned for that. For more episodes of this podcast, as well as my music discussion podcast, which relaunched this past Sunday, as well as my interview series, Anything Goes with Jackson Neill, go down to the link in the description to jacksonneillpodcast.com for archives of all of my podcasts. Now, if you're a really big fan of the show and want to become a subscriber and get some cool bonus content, head over to Patreon. There, for just a couple dollars a month, or basically $1 a month, you can get access to bonus content from this podcast, as well as my music podcast and my interview series, Anything Goes. I write, record, produce, do everything for these podcasts myself as a full-time college student, so any little bit of support just helps me spend more time making these cool episodes. If you want to stay up to date on everything that I'm doing, want to see some cool pictures and some funny tweets I like to think, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at JacksonNeil20. Today's music is by Analog by Nature with their song CDK Sunday. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you all next time.